Michelle Bernard had always taken pride in her home in Channing Cove, a quiet neighborhood nestled just outside Atlanta, Georgia. The brick house with its carefully maintained lawn was more than a place to live. It was a symbol of her independence, years of hard work, and countless sacrifices. But that sense of pride turned into a nightmare the day she received a letter from her Homeowners Association, HOA, informing her that a lien had been placed on her property. The letter, terse and impersonal, accused her of violating several community codes, infractions she found vague and unreasonable. Among them were charges for failing to trim her bushes to regulation height and for installing glass windows in her sunroom without seeking prior approval. But what shocked Michelle most was the amount. The HOA claimed she owed over $1,500 in fines, and the lien would remain until she paid in full. Michelle wasn't new to the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Over the years, she had watched neighbors quietly comply with their decisions, fearing retaliation. Some homeowners whispered stories of escalating fines, mysterious penalties, and even the requirement to submit written apologies for slander against board members. It was clear to Michelle that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Refusing to be intimidated, Michelle decided to fight back. She hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit, accusing the HOA of mismanagement, lack of transparency, and improperly modifying bylaws without the consent of the homeowners. Her suit wasn't just about the money, it was about principle. They were abusing their power, and nobody was holding them accountable, she said in an interview. As the case progressed, more troubling details emerged. Records showed that the HOA had been issuing fines without providing adequate notice, and that many board decisions were made behind closed doors. The financial records, when finally disclosed, raised further questions about how dues were being spent. Michelle's lawsuit quickly garnered attention from local media and advocacy groups focused on homeowner rights. Facing increasing public pressure and a mountain of legal evidence, the HOA eventually agreed to settle. Michelle was awarded $40,000 in damages, and the lien was removed from her property. More importantly, the settlement required the HOA to revise its bylaws, improve financial transparency, and allow homeowners greater input in governance decisions. Michelle's victory sent ripples through her neighborhood and beyond. Residents who had once felt powerless began to speak up. Other communities started questioning their own HOA practices. What started as a single woman's refusal to be silenced became a rallying cry for fairness and accountability in HOA-run neighborhoods across Georgia. "I didn't want to be a hero," Michelle said, "but I wasn't going to let them bully me out of my home." In the weeks following the settlement, Michelle noticed a change in the way her neighbors looked at her. Where once there had been polite nods or hesitant greetings, now there were conversations, questions, and above all, gratitude. Several residents who had endured the HOA's overreach in silence began to approach her. They shared their own stories about fines issued without warning, threats of legal action for trivial violations, and a growing fear of retaliation if they pushed back. Michelle listened carefully to each one. She realized that her lawsuit had opened a door many had believed permanently shut. For years, the HOA had operated unchecked, its small board of directors wielding disproportionate power over the lives of homeowners. Now, the balance of that power was beginning to shift. Despite the financial relief from the $40,000 settlement, Michelle's real reward came from the sense of justice she had helped restore. But the victory had come at a cost. The legal battle had dragged on for months, consuming hours of her time and putting immense emotional strain on her. There were moments when she questioned whether it was worth it, moments when the stress nearly broke her. But each time, she reminded herself of what was at stake, not just her home, but the principle that no one should be above accountability, not even a neighborhood HOA. The case also drew the attention of state lawmakers. One local representative, after reading about Michelle's ordeal, reached out to discuss possible reforms to HOA laws in Georgia. She met with his staff, sharing documents, correspondence, and her personal experiences. Soon, a bill was introduced in the state legislature aiming to require more financial transparency from HOAs, as well as limitations on their authority to place liens on homes without judicial oversight. Meanwhile, the Channing Cove HOA board underwent a transformation. Two of the original members resigned under pressure. New elections were held, and for the first time in years, more than half the neighborhood turned out to vote. Michelle, though urged by many to run, declined. She believed her role was to empower others, not to become the center of attention. Instead, she helped form a homeowners advisory committee, an informal group of residents committed to reviewing HOA policies and advocating for homeowner interests. Through monthly meetings and open forums, the committee became a platform for communication and community building. Where once the HOA had instilled fear, there was now an emerging culture of cooperation and shared responsibility. Yet not everything changed overnight. There were still disputes, still remnants of old tensions that flared up from time to time. One board member, a vocal opponent of Michelle during the lawsuit, tried to block several committee initiatives. But with support from the broader community and the new board leadership, the committee held its ground. Michelle often reflected on how something as impersonal as a lien letter had sparked such a profound transformation in her life and in her neighborhood. She remembered the early days of the conflict when she felt isolated and overwhelmed. She thought about the nights she spent reviewing HOA bylaws, meeting with lawyers, and preparing statements. It had taken every ounce of courage she had to stand up to an entity so entrenched in her community's daily life. What drove her ultimately was the belief that every homeowner deserves to live with dignity and respect. She refused to accept that paying dues meant surrendering rights. Her resolve inspired others, and together, they reshaped their community. As the first anniversary of her settlement approached, Michelle organized a small gathering in the local park. It wasn't a victory parade. She didn't believe in grandstanding, but a quiet celebration of resilience, courage, and community. Neighbors brought potluck dishes, children played, and for the first time in a long while, Channing Cove felt united. Michelle stood under a canopy of oak trees, looking out over the crowd. She wasn't thinking about the lawsuit or the money or even the reforms. She was thinking about the power of one voice and what happens when that voice is joined by many others. As summer gave way to fall, the energy in Channing Cove remained vibrant. People who had once stayed behind closed doors now greeted each other with warmth. A new sense of openness had settled in, and much of it was thanks to Michelle's unrelenting fight. The advisory committee she helped create continued to gain momentum. Attendance grew each month, and the meetings became a place not just to discuss problems, but to envision solutions. The committee soon began working on a community charter, a supplemental set of values and practices that promoted transparency, fairness, and inclusion. It wasn't a replacement for the HOA's bylaws, but rather a community-driven manifesto that reaffirmed the residents' right to participate and be heard. The effort took months of drafting and revisions, with homeowners volunteering their time to review, discuss, and edit every line. Michelle was at nearly every meeting, offering suggestions, facilitating conversations, and ensuring that no one felt excluded. Yet not everyone was happy with the changes. A small but vocal group of homeowners, many of whom had previously benefited from the HOA's more opaque practices, began to push back. They claimed the committee was trying to undermine the board's authority. Rumors circulated, and some even accused Michelle of pursuing a personal agenda. She was called names in online forums, and anonymous letters began appearing in her mailbox, warning her to let things go. But Michelle had grown stronger through her ordeal. She didn't flinch in the face of criticism. Instead, she doubled down on her commitment to making the community more equitable. "This isn't about control," she said during one particularly heated meeting. "It's about trust, and trust comes from listening to each other." Her steady voice and calm demeanor won her more supporters. Even those who were skeptical at first began to see the positive changes unfolding. Issues that once took weeks to resolve were now addressed in days. Decisions about landscaping, maintenance, and shared spaces were no longer made behind closed doors, but discussed openly with the input of residents. The community began to look and feel different too. With new volunteers pitching in, neglected park benches were repainted. Overgrown walking trails were cleared. A group of teens even organized a cleanup drive, collecting litter and planting flowers near the entrance sign to Channing Cove. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive with cooperation instead of burdened by conflict. Michelle watched all this unfold with quiet pride. But even as her neighborhood healed, she knew there were bigger battles ahead. Her story had caught the attention of regional homeowner advocacy organizations, and she began receiving invitations to speak at town halls and forums across Georgia. People wanted to hear from someone who had stood up to her HOA and won. At first, Michelle was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't something she enjoyed. She preferred one-on-one conversations, the kind where you could hear someone's pain and respond with empathy. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that her voice could help others in ways she never imagined. At her first speaking engagement, a modest gathering in a suburban library, she shared her journey from the moment she received that first fine to the day she signed the settlement. The room was silent as she described the feeling of powerlessness, the hours spent in legal limbo, the constant fear of losing her home. When she finished, the applause was long and heartfelt. After the talk, a middle-aged couple approached her, tears in their eyes. They had been fined nearly $10,000 by their HOA for what they claimed were trumped-up violations and were facing foreclosure. "You've given us hope," the woman said. "We thought we were alone." That moment confirmed everything for Michelle. Her fight wasn't just personal anymore, it was part of a movement. She began working with grassroots groups pushing for legislative reform. She gave interviews, wrote op-eds, and started a blog where homeowners could share their stories. Each post brought in more readers, and soon the comment sections filled with stories eerily similar to her own. The problem wasn't isolated, it was systemic. Through it all, Michelle kept her job as a freelance graphic designer, balancing client work with advocacy. She didn't want to become a professional activist. She simply wanted to ensure no one else endured what she had. But whether she liked it or not, her name had become synonymous with resistance against HOA overreach in Georgia. Still, she never lost sight of Channing Cove. It remained her anchor, the place where the fight began and where it continued in quieter, more personal ways. She still walked her dog through the park every morning. She still stopped to chat with neighbors and helped organize the community's first holiday decorating contest, a surprisingly unifying event that brought together even those who once opposed her. One snowy afternoon in December, Michelle received a letter, not from the HOA, but from a woman named Carla Harper, who lived several counties away. Carla had read about Michelle's case in a local paper and was inspired to take action against her own HOA, which had placed an unjust lien on her home while she was away on military duty. Carla's letter was full of frustration, but also of hope. "You proved that we don't have to be silent," she wrote. "You reminded us that this is still our home." Michelle folded the letter gently and placed it on her kitchen counter. She stared out the window at the quiet street, blanketed in snow, and felt something shift inside her, not closure, but continuity. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Summer arrived with the scent of magnolia and fresh-cut grass in Channing Cove. Children played in sprinklers, neighbors exchanged stories over grills, and a sense of cautious optimism lingered in the air. What had once been a community fractured by fear and silence was now stitched together by a shared belief in fairness. People didn't always agree, but now they knew their voices mattered. Michelle Bernard had become something of a local legend, though she never acted like it. When asked, she'd insist she was just a homeowner who got tired of being pushed around. But even she couldn't ignore how much had changed because of her. She wasn't just answering emails and speaking at events anymore. She was helping shape real legal reform. She was consulted on housing policy drafts, met with attorneys general, and even spoke in a televised town hall about homeowners' rights and HOA overreach. Through her site, Homeowner Justice, Michelle had built a coalition of homeowners across the country who were dealing with the same issues she had once faced alone. People from Texas, Florida, Arizona, and even California wrote in with horror stories, some eerily similar, some even worse. She read about veterans losing their homes over landscaping disputes, elderly couples fined thousands for unpainted fences, and single parents harassed into foreclosure. She started a newsletter to help inform others of their rights. It included step-by-step guides, updates on legal reforms, and templates for letters challenging improper fines. More than 40,000 people subscribed within the first few months. Michelle didn't profit from it. She refused to run ads or charge fees. It was her gift to a cause she believed in with her entire being. Still, with all this momentum, Michelle remained deeply connected to the ground level. She knew that real change didn't happen in conference rooms. It happened in kitchens, at front doors, at neighborhood meetings. She continued mentoring other homeowners who were preparing lawsuits of their own. Some she guided personally, helping them avoid the mistakes she had made. Others she simply encouraged, reminding them of their strength. But with growing visibility came growing resistance. Not everyone appreciated what Michelle was doing. Some HOA lobbyists accused her of inciting unrest. A handful of law firms that specialized in HOA enforcement even tried to discredit her by filing complaints and demanding investigations into her nonprofit. News segments aired featuring board members who claimed she was encouraging anarchy and misleading homeowners. Michelle refused to be rattled. "If they're trying this hard to silence me," she told one interviewer, "it means I'm being heard." Despite the attacks, support poured in. A group of pro bono attorneys formed a legal defense fund in her name. Several housing rights organizations offered her speaking platforms. Her blog received over 1 million views in a single month. She was nominated for a local civic leadership award, which she humbly accepted on behalf of every homeowner who ever stood up for their right to live with dignity. Back in Channing Cove, Michelle continued to be a quiet force for progress. When a new family moved into the neighborhood and received a citation for parking their trailer in the driveway, Michelle met with the HOA to discuss rewriting that particular code. By month's end, the board had adjusted the policy to allow weekend parking for family visits, an unheard-of compromise just 2 years earlier. Michelle didn't celebrate these moments publicly. She didn't post about them or seek recognition, but they meant the world to her. They were proof that change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. On the second anniversary of her settlement, the neighborhood threw a block party. It wasn't in her honor, it was just a celebration of summer. But nearly every person who walked past Michelle's house stopped to thank her. Some brought flowers, others brought food. One little girl handed her a crayon drawing of a house with the words, "Thank you, Miss Michelle," scribbled in pink above the roof. That night, as the fireworks lit up the Georgia sky, Michelle sat in her backyard with a glass of lemonade and a soft smile. Her dog, Riley, curled up beside her. She thought about the past 2 years, about the fear she'd once felt, about the nights she'd spent wondering if she'd lose her home, about the time she almost gave up. She also thought about what came next. There were talks of expanding homeowner justice into a full legal aid foundation. She'd been invited to join a national task force on HOA oversight. Lawmakers were drafting a federal proposal, something that could give homeowners in every state a consistent Bill of Rights. It was a long road ahead, filled with resistance and uncertainty. But she was ready. Michelle had once thought her battle was about saving a house, but now she understood. It had always been about protecting a home, not just hers, but everyone's. Because no one should fear losing their home over bureaucracy. Because no one should be silenced for asking questions. Because fairness isn't optional in a community, it's essential. And because even the smallest voice can start a revolution. Autumn returned to Channing Cove with golden leaves and a breeze that whispered through the trees like a song of change. Michelle had always loved this time of year. The crunch of the sidewalk under her boots, the scent of pine and wood smoke, and the calm that came between summer's energy and winter's stillness. But this year, the season carried an added weight. It marked a turning point. The Georgia HOA Fairness and Transparency Act, which Michelle had helped shape, had finally passed both chambers of the state legislature. It was a narrow victory, won by just 3 votes, but it was a victory nonetheless. The governor signed it into law at a small ceremony, attended by lawmakers, homeowners, and advocates. Michelle stood quietly in the background, her eyes misty as she watched the ink hit the page. The law imposed limits on the fines an HOA could issue, mandated third-party audits of HOA finances, and required that any liens be approved by a judge, not simply filed by the board. It also guaranteed homeowners the right to attend and speak at board meetings and required HOAs to make bylaws and financial records available on request. It wasn't perfect. It didn't undo past injustices, but it was a start. A very good start. After the signing, a reporter asked Michelle how it felt. "It feels like planting a seed," she replied. "You don't celebrate the seed, you wait for the tree. And I think we just planted something that will grow." Back in her neighborhood, the changes had ripple effects. Other communities in Georgia started adopting parts of the new law even before it took effect. Some HOA boards, sensing a shift in public sentiment, began opening their doors and including homeowners in decision-making. A few even invited Michelle to speak at their meetings, not as an enemy, but as a guide. She accepted those invitations with grace. She never came in swinging. Instead, she listened. She asked questions. She reminded board members that most of them were volunteers, neighbors themselves, and that a little empathy could prevent a lot of pain. She never embarrassed anyone, never acted superior, and perhaps that's why she won people over, even those who had once stood against her. Michelle also began mentoring a younger woman named Tasha, who lived in a nearby subdivision and had received a lien notice after painting her shutters a non-approved shade of blue. Tasha was fiery and passionate, but inexperienced. Michelle saw herself in her, the same urgency, the same fear, the same unwillingness to back down. Together, they filed paperwork, gathered documents, and wrote letters. And when the board backed down and canceled the lien, Tasha cried on Michelle's porch. "You changed my life," she said. Michelle shook her head. "You did that. I just walked with you for a little while." Word continued to spread. A national news program featured Michelle in a special segment called Voices of Resistance. She was filmed walking through Channing Cove, standing in front of the HOA sign that had once symbolized oppression but now marked a place of progress. "Do you still think about the settlement?" the interviewer asked. Michelle nodded. "Every day. Not because of the money, but because of what it meant. It proved that we have rights, that we can push back, that we don't have to accept injustice just because it's written in a bylaw." By now, Michelle was receiving speaking requests from all over the country, places where HOAs had become nightmares, not communities. She accepted some, declined others, always careful not to stretch herself too thin. She remained grounded. She still worked her freelance design gigs. She still hosted backyard potlucks. She still watered her marigolds every morning and waved to the kids waiting for the school bus. But she was different now. Not just stronger, but wiser. Not just louder, but more focused. She had learned that justice wasn't something you won once and kept forever. It was something you defended every day in 1,000 small ways. And it wasn't just about HOAs. It was about power, about who held it, who abused it, and who dared to speak up when it hurt. She had once been afraid to raise her voice. Now she raised others. She encouraged a woman in Nevada to file an appeal. She helped a veteran in Alabama recover his home. She consulted with legislators in 3 other states about writing similar bills. Her quiet battle in a Georgia subdivision had become a blueprint for homeowners across the country. And yet, through it all, Michelle never saw herself as a hero. She saw herself as a neighbor. That, more than anything, is what made her powerful. Because when neighbors speak up, change doesn't feel like a revolution. It feels like home. Winter came quietly to Channing Cove. A gentle frost kissed the rooftops, and the trees stood bare and proud, like sentinels keeping watch over the peaceful streets. Michelle Bernard sipped a mug of peppermint tea on her porch, watching the world move in quiet harmony. Christmas lights twinkled down the block, soft, tasteful, and no longer controversial. What once would have triggered an HOA citation was now simply part of the neighborhood's charm. There was a calm in her heart that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Not because the struggle was over, it wasn't, but because she now understood her place in it. She had become part of something larger than herself, a movement that had begun with a lien and grown into a landmark case, a nonprofit, a legislative reform, and a nationwide awakening. That winter, Michelle received a handwritten letter from a retired schoolteacher in Utah. The woman had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp without prior approval. Her HOA had refused to accommodate her despite the Americans with Disabilities Act. With help from Michelle's guides and resources, she'd taken her HOA to court and won. "You gave me the courage," the letter read, "to believe that fairness could still win." Michelle kept that letter, like she did so many others, in a box beneath her bed labeled reminders. She reread them on days when she felt tired or uncertain. They reminded her why she kept going, why she still answered emails at midnight, why she still stood behind podiums in city halls and small-town libraries. In January, the federal proposal she'd helped inspire was officially introduced to Congress, the Homeowner Protections and HOA Reform Act. It was ambitious, and it would face stiff opposition, but even being introduced was a win. Lawmakers cited Michelle's work directly in their press releases. National housing advocacy groups named her one of the most influential homeowner advocates in the country. And still, she chose to stay rooted. She never moved away from Channing Cove. She never sought office. She didn't start a consulting firm. She kept her life simple. She believed that true leadership didn't come from titles. It came from presence, from being there when someone needed you, from answering the phone, from showing up. One February morning, as snow dusted the sidewalk and her breath rose like mist in the cold, Michelle received a knock on her door. It was Tasha, the young woman she'd once mentored, now holding a folder and a nervous smile. "I want to start something," Tasha said. "A local group, a watch network, something to help people before it gets too far." Michelle smiled and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. "Let's make a plan." They sat at her kitchen table for hours, mapping things out, drawing diagrams, creating templates. And by the time the afternoon sun dipped low, casting amber light through the windows, Michelle realized something important. She wasn't just a voice anymore. She was a mentor, a builder, a torch passer. She had sparked a chain reaction, and others were now carrying the flame. That spring, Channing Cove hosted its first ever civic fair. Michelle gave a short speech at the gazebo in the Central Park. Nothing flashy, nothing angry. Just a simple story of how a fight for her home became a fight for everyone's. Afterward, people lined up, not to congratulate her, but to talk, to share, to connect. One man asked her advice about bylaws. A mother asked how to appeal a landscaping citation. A teenager simply said, "You make me want to stand up when something's wrong." Michelle's eyes shimmered. "Then I've done what I came to do." Years from now, the headlines will forget the details, the settlement amount, the court docket, the HOA name. But those who lived through it, those who stood on their porches wondering if they'd be next, would remember her. they'd remember the woman who didn't back down, the woman who turned a lien into a legacy, the woman who reminded them that homes aren't just built from brick and drywall, they're built on dignity and the right to live without fear. Michelle Bernard changed her neighborhood. Then she changed her state. And maybe, just maybe, she helped change the country. One paragraph at a time. One homeowner at a time. One light, left on through the darkness.